Hello everyone, this is my presentation on structural racism. Today I'll be presenting on the issue of structural racism in the United States. Structural racism is not merely a collection of individual acts of prejudice, but instead a deeply entrenched system embedded in societal policies, cultural narratives, and institutional practices. It creates and perpetuates enduring qualities that disproportionately harm marginalized communities. My analysis explores three key examples of structural racism. We'll be exploring the impact of Hurricane Katrina, racialized drug law enforcement, and corruption within the criminal justice system. Using sociological insights from W.E.B. Du Bois and C. Wright Mills, I argue that systemic reform, not just addressing individual biases, is essential to dismantling these inequalities. Structural racism is an institutionalized system that perpetuates racial disparities. My research examines how policies, institutions, and cultural narratives reinforce inequities. For example, urban planning practices historically push Black communities into vulnerable areas, while media portrayals often perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Similarly, the criminal justice system disproportionately targets and marginalizes communities of color. The purpose of my research is to expose the mechanisms that maintain these inequalities and advocate for systemic reform. Understanding structural racism requires recognizing its historical roots and current manifestations. My thesis is as follows. Structural racism, deeply embedded into societal policies, cultural narratives, and institutional practices, perpetuates enduring qualities that disadvantage marginalized communities. However, while some argue that systemic reform alone can dismantle these injustices, others contend that addressing individual biases and localized issues may offer an overall more effective path towards racial equality. My thesis highlights the systemic nature of racism and introduces the debate over how to best address it. Throughout this presentation, I will argue that systemic reform is the only viable solution. Structural racism is not a collection of individual biases, but instead a system that influences economic, legal, and cultural domains. It is built into policies and institutional practices, maintaining racial inequities over time. Social structures refer to the frameworks, such as urban planning, zoning laws, and resource allocation, that organize society and disproportionately harm marginalized groups. Hurricane Katrina illustrates both concepts. Historical housing policies forced Black communities in New Orleans into low-lying, flood-prone areas. These patterns were not accidental. They were the result of systemic discrimination dating back all the way to the 19th century. When Hurricane Katrina struck, these communities were hit the hardest, experiencing catastrophic losses in lives, homes, and resources. The government's inadequate response further exposed how social structures prioritize certain groups over others, leaving marginalized communities vulnerable to crises. Individual prejudice is often mistakenly viewed as the root of racism, but as Hurricane Katrina shows, racism operates at a systemic level. During the crisis, media coverage relied on long-standing racial stereotypes. For example, news headlines released on August 30th, 2005, portraying two separate pictures. One was a young African-American man walking through the deep water who was described as a looter with the intention of showing how people were stealing from stores desperately in the time of crisis. Meanwhile, a separate picture of a white family moving through the water was described as a troubled couple simply searching for food. This blatant double standard reflects cultural narratives rooted in historical biases. Thomas Jefferson's writings about Black inferiority exemplify how these stereotypes were institutionalized. They were used to justify slavery, segregation, and unequal treatment. These biases persist today, shaping public narratives and influencing how society perceives and treats marginalized groups. During Hurricane Katrina, these harmful narratives dehumanized Black communities and justified neglect in government responses, further reinforcing structural inequities. These harmful stereotypes and overall viewing of the Black community largely stem from Jim Crow laws. Although they were no longer in effect when the hurricane struck, the way in which African Americans were viewed as a whole, as unworthy individuals never completely left. Public narratives are powerful tools that shape societal attitudes and institutional behavior. During Hurricane Katrina, as I said in the last slide, media narratives painted Black survivors as criminals rather than victims, perpetuating harmful stereotypes. These narratives not only influence public opinion, but also justify unequal treatment in policy and resource allocation. This reflects how cultural narratives and structural racism intersect, creating a cycle where marginalized groups are consistently denied resources and opportunities. Public narratives are therefore a critical component of structural racism as they reinforce systemic biases and shape institutional responses. Systemic racism is particularly evident in the enforcement of drug policies in the United States. Despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups, Black and brown individuals are disproportionately arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced for drug-related offenses. The sociological theory of social deviance explains how certain groups are labeled as deviant based on systemic biases rather than actual behavior. For example, Black communities are over-policed, increasing their likelihood of arrest, while white individuals engaging in similar activities are less likely to face consequences. This criminalization of marginalized communities perpetuates cycles of poverty and incarceration. Rather than addressing substance misuse as a public health issue, the system treats it as a criminal issue, exacerbating systemic inequalities. Social hierarchies within the criminal justice system further entrench systemic racism. Institutional corruption, such as prison guards accepting bribes to smuggle contraband, disproportionately harms marginalized inmates who lack the resources to participate in these exchanges. This reflects institutional deviance, where corruption becomes normalized within systems that are meant to uphold justice. These power imbalances exacerbate inequalities, as marginalized individuals are further disadvantaged by corrupt practices. This shows the concept of the subordinate group, where inmates are treated ultimately as lower individuals. For example, inmates that come from low-income backgrounds often lack access to legal resources or financial support, making them more vulnerable to exploitation. This highlights how structural racism operates within institutions which are meant to be for justice, reinforcing barriers for already marginalized groups. C. Wright Mills' concept of the sociological imagination provides a framework for understanding structural racism as a product of historical and social forces. Mills emphasizes the importance of linking individual experiences to broader systemic contexts. For instance, the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina can be traced back to settlement patterns first established in the 1830s. These historical decisions placed Black communities in the most vulnerable areas, a reality compounded by systemic neglect over decades. The sociological imagination allows us to see how these historical decisions continue to shape present inequalities, emphasizing that structural racism is not just a current issue, but instead a legacy of the past. To conclude, structural racism is deeply embedded in societal policies, cultural narratives, and institutional practices. Addressing individual biases alone cannot dismantle the frameworks that perpetuate inequality. W.E.B. Du Bois and C. Wright Mills provide critical insights for understanding and addressing these issues. To put it simply, Du Bois emphasizes resilience and leadership in marginalized communities, and Mills highlights the importance of understanding the historical and social forces shaping inequality. To finally achieve racial equality, society must adopt a systemic approach that combines historical awareness with proactive reform. This is not just about correcting individual acts of prejudice, it is about dismantling the structures as a whole that have upheld inequality for centuries. So these were the sources that I'd used. And on a final note, I would just like to reiterate that the only way for this problem to completely come to an end is for society as a whole to come together and have a shift of mindset. Thank you for listening.